The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Good evening. I'm Donna Wares, editor of the LA Times Book Club. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as we welcome Walter Thompson-Hernández, author of the new book, The Compton Cowboys. Tonight, we're also celebrating a special milestone. It's been exactly a year this week since we launched our community book club. And as you probably know, every month we bring Times readers together, we share a book, and then we host an event with an amazing author. Tonight, our special guest is a journalist and a photographer who has traveled the world documenting little-known subcultures from Mexico to Guyana. Several years ago, Walter Thompson-Hernández was drawn back to his Southern California roots to immerse in a community of Black riders who find hope and healing on horseback. The motto of the Compton Cowboys is "Streets raised us, horses saved us." And we're going to be hearing more about the book tonight. And during our book club, I'd like to invite you to share your questions either on the Times Facebook page or by email at bookclub@latimes.com. We're going to be bringing Walter on in just a moment. But first, I thought it'd be fun to introduce you to the real-life Compton Cowboys. We have a video created by Mark Potts from the group's peace ride through the city of Compton on June the 6th. And here it is.
You know, I'm originally from Compton, migrated to the Valley. So as a little kid, I used to ride horses out here. So have a good time watching us have a good time because we love doing it.
I'm just out here to support Black lives in our community. I hope that they see a lot of our community is branching together and we're fighting against inequality. Black lives matter.
This is my city, you know what I'm saying? I grew up in Compton. I was born and raised in Compton. I grown up riding horses in Compton, you know? So when we put all of those things together, I just felt like it was my duty, my objective to be here.
I brought water, some beer, feed for the animals, apples. That's about it. I got some stuff to make signs. Hold it down for the city, right?
How you doing? I didn't know you rode. Oh my goodness.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Say his name.
George Floyd.
Say his name.
George Floyd.
Say his name.
George Floyd. I can't breathe.
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 I can't breathe. The city of Compton is the center of this world and the culture as we know it. And so we have an opportunity to be able to show the world that's watching how peaceful we are, but at the same time, we'll have some calls to action as God leads us. Those that want to loot and those that may want to prostitute this moment. And we say, God, protect our city, protect our culture, protect our community, protect our people. In the name above all names, Jesus' name. And if you believe it, say amen. I challenge all you guys to continue to stick together through thick and thin, continue to fight for one another, continue to lift one another up, continue to support businesses, continue to protect your home, protect your team, protect your family. And at times like this, we need to stick together. Put a fist up.
Since I've been in the league, I bleed Compton, I claim Compton every single day, every single step of the way with the Compton High. Just to be here to see all of us together, that's what it's about, man. We can do great things, and we are going to do great things. Let's all stick together, keep loving each other, and let's make this a celebration, man. Let's continue to strive for greatness and be better, even better after this.
It's my auntie vision, you feel me? Right. My daddy vision, you feel me? I feel like I'm making my family proud, you feel me? We making the whole hood proud, bro. We making the city proud, you know what I'm saying? Like, this shit is surreal in real life.
And now, I'd like to introduce you to Walter Thompson-Hernández and my colleague, Angel Jennings. She's a reporter here at the Times, and I'd like to welcome them both to the LA Times Book Club. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
How are you guys doing?
I'm holding up. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you both to the book club, and you know, obviously these are crazy times for all of us, and so I'm just curious, Walter, how have you been doing during the pandemic? What have you been up to?
Yeah, these are strange times, right? Like, I think I've been trying to do my best, you know, by like staying positive and staying healthy. I've been busy working actually, but you know, just trying to stay positive, you know, because I think so many people's lives have been affected, and you know, I'm just trying to stay hopeful and you know, keep doing you know, good work.
Angel is a reporter here at the Times since 2011, and she joins us from the Times newsroom tonight. Welcome, first visit to our book club. So
Thank
glad
you
you
for
could be here.
having me.
So I know you often write about South Los Angeles, and for all of us, our lives have changed so much, and our work has changed so much in the past few months. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your job right now and the kinds of stories that you've been writing.
So I'm in the newsroom for the first time in months, and it was quite a different process to get in here. So for the last few months, I've been actually reporting from my home in my car sometimes, and like really kind of digging into meaty stories by like trying to see what people are talking about online, and every now and then trying to cautiously go out and talk to people about the stories and what's happening in their lives. For the first couple of months of the coronavirus pandemic, I was focusing solely on that, like how this virus was disproportionately impacting Black and Latino residents, many of them in South LA, the lack of testing offered in the area, as well as how people were coming up with creative ways to maintain a living during this time. Like I went to a speakeasy barbershop where people were doing underground hairstyles. And also I talked to a family who also lost their dad, and that kind of like heart-wrenching story. But now like my beat has shifted a bit. I am actually doing more stories about the protests and what this moment means for Black LA and for Black Americans in general. I live in an area and cover South LA that had risen up in 1992. And this time it looks different, it feels different. And like so many people want to know, like, will it be different? And I'm kind of chronicling that for the paper.
Oh, thank you. Walter, I know we started the show off by looking at the Peace Ride that was on June the 6th. And it was a ride by the Compton Cowboys, but then they invited other riders from across Southern California. And so people turned out in horseback, and there were families on foot and people with strollers. And it was really an amazing crowd. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what it was like to be out there on that Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a really powerful moment, right? Because like you had the city of Compton, out on foot and obviously on horses, right? And I think it was really powerful because the Compton Cowboys like organized this Black Southern California, horse riding sort of demonstration. There were about 100 Black folks on horses out there, and I think it was powerful because it was the first time that I had ever seen, like horses on the side of the demonstrators, right? Like I think usually horses are used by mounted police, to kind of show authority and force. And I think it was really special and really inspiring, really, for a lot of the demonstrators to see the Compton Cowboys, ride in a really peaceful way.
Well, we're looking forward to hearing more about your book and your work in general. So at this point, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Angel, and I'll join you a little bit later. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. So also watching that reel of the peaceful protests at in Compton, it reminded me of that section in the book where everyone was coming together and Randy was deciding whether to actually meet up with the other riders in Southern California. And like it seemed like this was the moment where it actually happened. So it felt kind of real special to see that all culminate on video. Was that what it felt like for you?
You know, it's funny because I haven't even thought about that, but you're absolutely right, Angel. There's a moment in the book where like there's a potential tension between the Compton Cowboys and other Black riding clubs, and I think you're absolutely right. Like I think this was a moment where it sort of all comes together. You know, I think Randy, did a really great job at sort of like coalescing other Black riders, during this current moment. I think like we're seeing right now that this like march and ride for racial equity requires everyone. So I think like Randy in so many different ways sort of like brought that story full circle and invited other riders. That's a really great point. Absolutely.
And then even that, like, I know that, we hear about the pull and tug between Randy being a leader, but also he's leading friends that he grew up with. And like that pull of like the respect and having that authority, but still, want to be cool. And like, I think like seeing that all coalesce into this moment, like you kind of really show like at the time he said like, no, we're not going to ride. This is not the time. But then he picked the perfect moment to gather everyone together and say like, we're going to go out, we're going full force. And then like seeing that moment on camera, it felt like the parade.
Yeah.
It felt like that opening scene all over again. Like I got the glimpse of the joy with people like with the videos and them on horseback and all the imagery. I'm like, it's like the book coming to life.
It's the parade, right? No, like that's a great observation. I think the book starts with the Compton Christmas Parade, right, which happens every year. And in 2018, when I was writing this book, like I was able to be there, at the Christmas parade when they rode, and it was a really special moment because this was the first time in about 15 years that the Compton Cowboys had rode together, as adults. So I think, like in 2018, it was a really sort of like monumental moment, right? Like you have like young men who are now riding as adults, who had their own children and own families and sort of like really committed to preserving this like really rich and beautiful story. And I think like the idea that that parade scene sort of comes to life is like both beautiful and tragic, right? Like it's beautiful that it sort of happened in like a really visual way, but it's also tragic that like the circumstances by which it happened, happened to be the death of Black men and women right now.
And it was so crazy to me to read that book and all the themes that were in your book kind of reemerging at this moment. Like we're thinking about over policing and police harassment. We're thinking about racism when we're talking about how the Black Cowboys and the Compton Cowboys are treated differently among even like the veterinarians. And then even that moment of like the uprising, like how you talked about characters having gone through the 1965 rebellion, the 1992 uprising, and now they're at this moment of 2020. Like it's all these like moments coalescing and we're here, and it's all the themes that run parallel to this book as well. I can't imagine you thought that would be the case when you were writing this book.
No, I really had no idea. I think like my intention was to be entirely present in this moment. Like this book is really a sort of ethnographic project, right? Like I spent a year and a half with the Cowboys and really was able to immerse myself into their lives. I was really lucky that they trusted me with their stories. And what that meant was that like I spent every single day with the Cowboys, essentially for a year and a half. And like I didn't see any of this coming, but also at the same time, it's like I did, right? Because spending a year and a half with these men and women in Compton, like I really was able to see how they experience life, how the police treats them, the sort of like tragedies in their life, and also like joyful moments too, right? But I think, it's my hope that people see this book as more than a book about cowboys, right? Like this is really a book about race in America, about what it means to be a Black man in America, and the sort of really creative ways that Black folks have been forced, right, to find ways to survive, right? And it happens to be for this group of friends, they've chosen horses to survive. And, like I said earlier, I think that's like both beautiful and tragic, right?
Yes, it really is. And like you talked about like how you were embedded with them for a year and a half. Walk me through that, because one of the things that jump out most to me is how real the dialogue is. Like I hear their voices, I can hear the cadence, and I know that required a lot of trust. It requires you to have been on 24/7, which is hard to do as a journalist. Like sometimes when I'm working on a story and I'm embedded for 8 hours, it's just like there's so many elements happening, you become almost overwhelmed and you almost worried you might miss something. Tell me, as a reporter, as you know, how did you get in, gain their trust, and how did you know what was noise and what were poignant moments?
Absolutely. Those are great questions, Angel. I think, it was interesting, right? Because I think like before writing this book, I had been traveling like essentially around the world working on stories about subcultures, right? And what that meant was that like I'd be in a place like Ghana or Japan or Colombia or Brazil or Madagascar, and I'd be there for like 12 days or so, like 2 weeks. And what that meant was that like I'd have to sort of like really immerse myself into this community and experience and really, just like grapple with like every sound and interview and experience. So I think the training for this book really came from like my work as a journalist, right? Like covering subcultures. But I think one thing that really helped me was that, and what was different in terms of like documenting the story is that like I'm a person of color, like I'm someone who was raised 10 minutes away from the ranch. Like I'm the same age as these cowboys. We all kind of identify in the same way. So I think like understanding like the nuance, and especially with like cadence and like communication and how folks are speaking, like I really wanted to like, you know, get that on paper, right? And to sort of like whatever I'm hearing to really like put that on paper. And I think like, as a person of color, right, like it's really important, right? I think we have that, like we have the ability to like, to like tell stories as we hear them and to also gain the trust of the people who we spend time with. I think the difference was that like I wasn't sort of parachuting into this community, like I literally live 10 minutes away. So like this was like also my story in a sense too. And I think that trust and rapport was like established early on. And I think it kind of shows it in the writing, hopefully.
It does. And I think we're at this moment in time, again, like your book and what you did with the book, like run with so many themes that we're experiencing now as newsrooms are grappling with, how they're covering stories and diversity. Like representation matters. Being able to get in those stories, get into the heart of it, and like also what you don't have to explain when you're of the culture. Like there's like this moment where there was that fight between Treys and they jumped him. There's no way they probably sat down and told you like, oh, you can't jump people, but you knew the language of the streets.
Yeah,
like,
no,
I think,
I mean, and yeah, totally. And like I said earlier, I think what was unique about me writing this book was that like I was both a participant, because I'm from the community, like we all speak the same language, we all grew up in the same era. But I'm also an observer, right? So I think like, and that's one thing that I think, writers of color, like we have access to our communities because we're a part of the community and like we understand our communities. And also I think so many of us are really sort of like tired of having to explain or over explain our culture, right?
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Or how we speak. And I think like it's always been my goal, and especially recently, right? To like not explain, but just document. And like, the onus and the work shouldn't be on us to explain, our stories and our experiences to like white folks essentially, right? But they should do their own work and own research and like understand that like, our stories also matter too.
And you mentioned you have been documenting subcultures for years, and like they sound like some pretty interesting stories. Why then tell this story? What stuck with you and made you want to dive in deep and be with this group for a year and a half and tell their story?
Absolutely. I mean, to be honest, like this story sort of happened because I was really homesick, right? And like I was traveling all over the world essentially, and I was home for like a week and a half, and I was like, man, how do I stay home for longer than a week and a half? So I thought about like what story I can maybe do in LA, and like any millennial writer or a journalist, like I found them on Instagram, and I was like, oh, it's like these are the same cowboys who I saw as a child, and I wonder if like there's a connection there, and like it seems really cool and interesting. So I sent them a DM on Instagram, and the rest is history. Like I showed up to the ranch, and they're really shocked, right? Because they were expecting like some older white dude from like Connecticut to be a New York Times writer, but like I showed up to the ranch, and there was like this almost immediate connection and friendship that happened.
sometimes some of our best stories are in our backyard or in our digital backyard by even just scrolling on Instagram and Twitter. I found that too. And so I've covered Compton for several years as well. I covered them like earlier. Now I'm a little bit more focused into like Leimert Park area, South LA. But when I was covering Compton, it was during the time of the old guard shifting power to the new guard of Asia Brown, this young Black woman who just has excited the city. And when she stepped into that role, like she was like so many other people trying to change the narrative of Compton, because we have these images of the city from decades ago, NWA, gangster rap, even in pop culture, like the music, you know, was kind of angry and, you know, talking about the police, like we all know the song. But like what you did so great and so beautifully in this book was like you talked about what this area was before then, how it was a place of hope in the 1950s and 60s, where Black people came from the South and the Midwest to really kind of like live out their dreams, their California dreams, and in many ways, their American dreams, like escaping Jim Crow and just wanting to be seen and full and be able to just like live their life. Like, I love how you picked up characters and kind of like juxtaposition them against each other. You have like Diego, who you talked about his dream coming in from Mexico and how he's now homeless. And then Jerome as well. Why it was like, and I noticed that it was always in pairs. It was always like a Black family and a Mexican family. Tell me, why did you do that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, like I'm kind of biased, right? Because my father is Black and my mom's Mexican, and I feel like a big part of me like always wants to really shed light on those experiences and kind of like really shatter the stereotypes that like Black and brown folks are either, you know, fighting or like hugging or getting along, right? You know, I think that relationship is so much more complex than that. But I think like, you know, that's kind of my lens, right? Like whenever I see LA or whenever I see the world, like I'm always looking at the world with like a Black and brown lens. You know, it's like unavoidable for me. So like that's what I pick up. So in this book and in this story, right? Like of course I'm gonna see Diego, right? Like of course I'm gonna see Jerome. And of course, I'm gonna like want to ask them more questions about their lives because I think they're fascinating. I think they're beautiful and complex. And so, you know, to be honest, like that's my favorite part of the book actually, where like I write about Jerome and write about Diego, and like you know, and I learned about them because I was like there. You know, I was in Compton every single night, and I sort of like you know brushed into him one night and started to ask him questions. And yeah, so I kind of have a bias, right? Like I'm always really interested in sort of like drawing connections between Black and brown folks. And I think the book shows that, right? Like the book shows that like Compton is obviously like, you know, its demographics have changed in recent years. You know, it's like a predominantly Latino community now, but you know, this idea of Black folks still being there is super important. And I think the Compton Cowboys are a great example of that.
But I think again, this is another wonderful thing about having, you know, a Black and Latino reporter tell this story or author tell this story, because any other person, when you read about LA, like we talk about people talk about homelessness and talk about the homeless population or people who are without homes, and they don't have a name, they don't have a story. And like we're getting in depth with that in newspaper articles, but like in books, they're just like a little dot on the landscape, and you actually like show us the full tapestry of their lives and like weave us into like how they make this place Compton what it is. And I think that was very enlightening to learn. Like you have all these, like you have hope, and then you have all these like shattered dreams. And then you do that again with the Cowboys as well. Want to pivot a little bit to Randy. And like, what is Randy doing now?
Yeah, Randy's doing it all. You know, he's like such an incredible person. I think Randy's spirit is so strong, and like he has this innate sense of leadership to him. You know, like he's a natural born leader. You know, and his aunt Maisha Akbar, who actually started the Compton Posse. You know, I feel like he's always kind of looked up to her and just like absorbed like all of her charm and charisma and you know just how to lead people. So Randy is leading the Compton Cowboys, and he's sort of like the brains behind the brains and heart actually behind the whole operation. Like he's fundraising every single day. He's doing interviews. He's like managing the Compton Cowboys, you know, which can be tough sometimes because like they have so many different personalities. But yeah, Randy's like someone who grew up in Compton, born and raised, who went to Occidental College and is the only college grad out of the group. And you know, he's someone who like could have left Compton, right? Like he could have went and lived somewhere else, but he chose to stay in Compton and make a big difference.
I think also what drives home for me with Randy, like how he thinks of imagery, like how he switched the style from the European style to back to the Western style, because like that connected more with the Black cowboy experience. But even when like doing the Peace March in Compton, it was called a Peace Rally. And I kept seeing that over and over as they were advertising it on Instagram and social media. And even one of the videos that opened, it's like, oh, this is a peace rally. Like he's very conscious of those things that could be used, you know, in a different way, in a negative connotation with different people, like kind of owning the narrative. How else has he done that, you know, since coronavirus hit, and now that he's trying to like keep the ranch going?
Absolutely. So like I said, I think Randy is like such a brilliant mind. You know, like he understands like aesthetics, and he understands imagery, and he understands like perception in the world, right? Like he understands that like if you call a certain event by a certain name, that might be sort of like misconstrued and really sort of portrayed in a really negative light. Like he's a really bright guy, so he gets that. But I think, you know, right now Randy is trying to keep the ranch afloat. You know, the pandemic really affected the ranch. Before the pandemic, the ranch was sort of living in a sort of like month to month basis. You know, it costs a lot of money to keep the ranch alive. And the youth program, right, had to be paused because of the pandemic. So, you know, they're selling horses sometimes. Like they are having to furlough some cowboys at the ranch. But like, I'm confident that he's going to find a way.
It was eye-opening when I read that line. It was $25,000. Like I think it was like a month to take care of the ranch. I was like, wow, that's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, that's a lot of money anywhere, you know, like that's a lot of money in any part of the country. And, you know, like I said, it's why the ranch is like on the verge of closing every single month. And, you know, it's also why I think like I wrote this book in a way that really sort of like portrays the ranch as this like central figure in the book, right? You know, in a way like, you know, the sort of arteries that run through the ranch, like are the characters and are their stories, but like, you know, ranch is home, and home in this book is like so much more than a physical space, right? It's like an emotional space, a spiritual space. So I think like the ranch is a central figure, and you know, like the fate of the ranch is like how I tried to frame the narrative arc of the book as well.
I thought like one of the most touching themes throughout was the healing powers of the horses. Like even their themes is like the streets raised us, but horses saved us. And like we see nowhere do we see that more than in Anthony, and that kind of nervousness after he came back from his jail stint. Like I kind of felt it for him, and I wanted to like, oh, just have the nerves to ask, because sometimes we are so scared of disappointment. And then like how he like channeled that, like even in jail with the Skittles. How did you find out about the Skittles drawings? Like, and tell me about that moment, because like I know as a journalist, there are moments that happen that like just gives me chills when it's happening, because I know that it's amazing and it like speaks larger than any words I can write. Like, tell me, how did you stumble upon that, and how did you get him to share that with you?
Absolutely. I think, you know, like that sort of happened naturally. You know, like Anthony is a person who I spent the most time with. Like he, you know, arrives to the ranch at like 5 a.m. in the morning, and he leaves at about 1 to go pick up his daughters and granddaughters. And so like Anthony's someone who I was almost with every single day. And I think like the way that I ask questions, right? Like I just try to really sort of like be present, you know, and not have this like strict sort of interview protocol, right? Where I'm following an interview. Like I'll maybe think about like 2 or 3 larger sort of like general questions and kind of just go from there. But like I wanted to learn more about Anthony's stint in prison. You know, I think that was a really sort of like formative part of his life, and it really sort of set the tone for what happened after that, right? And you know, I asked him about his time in prison. I asked him like what he did and how he felt about being in prison, and more importantly, like how he passed time. And you know, like I got chills when I sort of like realized like where the conversation was going, right? Like when he said like, oh yeah, like I used to draw in prison, you know, and I used to paint, and you know, like something sort of happened in my mind. I was like, well, what'd you draw and what'd you paint? You know, and he was like, I drew horses and I painted horses, and these horses are what sort of like helped me to stay present and focused in prison. And you know, I asked him like what he used to draw or what he used to paint, and he was like, I use Skittles. You know, like I use Skittles candy. And like I just sort of had this moment where I was like, what do you mean you use Skittles? Like, how does that work? Like, you know, walk me through that. And he was like, yeah, like I had, you know, I created a system, an art system in my prison cell where, I would use Skittles candy and mix it with water to create different colors. Like I would mix it with this color and this color to get this color. And I was just fascinated. I was like, this guy is like so brilliant and like such a genius and is an artist really, right? And he's someone who like is making the most of the situation and like creating art for like not just himself, but for other inmates, right? Like he becomes known as the artist in prison who like will draw and paint you a horse for your daughter, and it just becomes this like, it becomes like this, and I'm getting chills right now even thinking about this, right? Wow. Because like his story is so beautiful, and I think Anthony is like one of the most beautiful human beings I've ever met in my life.
And where is he now? What is he doing now? Is he still working at the ranch, still up at 5 a.m, taking care of the horses?
Yeah, he's probably sleeping right now because he has to wake up. He has to wake up at 4 a.m. every single day, so he's probably asleep right now. But yeah, he's at the ranch and he's feeding the horses and he's like tending to the whole ranch.
And then we have, like, I think for me, because I'm a woman, I connected most with Kiera's story. Like, it was like her daughter. And like, to me, that just like, she was doing everything for her daughter, but also realizing she wanted to live her dreams for herself so that she can live for her daughter and provide. And we saw her in that video. Is she back in Compton?
She's back in Compton, like I followed Kiera to Houston, right? Like Kiera and her daughter, Taylor, moved to Houston about a week after I took this photo here, and she moved to Houston because she had this rodeo dream, right? Like she wanted to be the first Black woman to win a rodeo national championship, and so she moved to Houston with no job set up, really just like on a whim, and moves in with a friend of hers who also rode horses out there, who also happens to be from Compton too. Her name is Jasmine, and so Kiera, I spent about a week with her out there. I finished writing the book in Houston, and about 4 months later, Kiera calls me one day. She's like, "Hey, Walter, I'm heading back to Compton, And I was like, "What happened? What rodeo? What happened?" She was like, "Man, like it just didn't work out, she had a back injury, and it just wasn't working out for her." But I think like Kiera is someone who like I'm so inspired by her, and she's actually a good friend of mine now. And like, everything she did, to your point, was for her daughter, Taylor, and even like, there's a moment in the book where she sort of has to wrestle with this tension, right? She's like, me going to Houston is taking away a semblance of like stability that my daughter had here in Compton. In Compton, she has a support system. She has her grandma, she has her mother, she has friends and family. But in Houston, she kind of has nothing, right? So I think like that moment kind of really shows us like the extent that we like the things we do to pursue our dreams, right? The dreams that we think will not only benefit us, but also like our children and her daughter in this case.
And even though she went to Houston, like she was still surrounded by, like you said, Compton slang. Like it felt like it was still like some semblance of Compton within those four walls. Mm-hmm. And that like her daughter was able to like get into a routine. But like even you telling me that she returned home from Compton, it to me, it was inevitable, not just because of her story, but because it's home. Like, what draws you to a place is just like home. And like the ranch is that, the city of Compton is that. So like, I just felt like it was a fitting moment for her. Like I could see her returning home and still thriving like she is now.
Definitely.
Go ahead.
That's it. No, yeah, you got it.
And so many others, we have, there's 10 characters and you give them all the space to tell their stories. And like, I think in so many other books, they make you pick like that one main character that's supposed to stand out. We're supposed to follow them and feel their pain. But like, I get so much depth and layers in the city by hearing all these voices. Talk about that decision to make sure to make every voice and every character in here heard and seen.
Yeah, I think that was really important for me, right? Like it was really important for me to give like most of the characters like the space and room to breathe and to exist, right? Like I think it was really important for me to like both present this narrative arc, right? That kind of takes the reader somewhere, but also to like, go off in this sort of like non-linear way where like, there's like tension and there's conflict in each of these characters' lives. And there's also like them trying to figure out their lives, but there's also the main story happening, So I think it was actually a challenge for me, right? Because like, I had never wrote a book before, like all the stories I had done were like 2,000 words or 1,500 words. And it's really different writing an 80,000 word book, right? Like for the first time, I had to sort of like, like do like a chapter by chapter sort of writing thing. Like I never really frame stories like that. Like I just used to just write, like I never, created like a frame for the story or anything like that. So this story really forced me to like really think about each character and like how they were also in conversation with one another, right? And I think that was one of the hardest parts.
You said you went on the trip with Kiera. Did you also go on the trip, I think, with Trey when he went to the rodeo as well, like when they were pulled over?
No, I've been asked that question, and the answer is no. Like that would have been.
It felt like it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it felt like it because like I asked Trey so many questions, and I asked his friend, and I asked friends of theirs who also were in conversation with them during that trip. So like I kind of got like not just Trey and his friends like perspective, but also everyone who was associated with that experience and trip. Like just to like kind of fact check, and just to verify. But yeah, I think like why it feels like I was there during that trip, and even throughout the book, is that in some ways I was, right? I think like the time I spent with Trey, spending a year and a half with like these guys really allowed me to sort of like piece their stories together, like, okay, here's what happened going to Texas, and like maybe Trey doesn't feel comfortable talking about that the rest right now, but maybe like in a month or so he will. And like in a month or so, I asked him about that trip, and every month I learned more about that trip, and he started to open up more. And that was a really tough time because like Trey's a really really tough guy, and for so many of the Cowboys like and Cowgirls, right, it was like their first time sort of like opening up about these stories, right, filled with so much like trauma actually, and as we know, right, like for like a lot of like folks of color in the hood, like we don't have access to resources like therapy that allow us to like make sense of these traumas and make sense of these like really tough experiences. And so for a lot of these young men and women, this was the first time that they were sort of talking about these things. So it was a really sort of like emotional experience. Like there was often tears and there was like rage, and I sort of had to find a way to process all that as they were processing it too.
And it's so often, like when people are sharing their stories, like they've never been given the platform to share it before, not just like in a journalistic or book setting, but just like no one like kind of sit down and ask them like, how are you really feeling? How are you really doing? What really happened to you? Why? Like you talk about like how horses bring out the softness in people. What caused the hardness? It's not just, it's life. And like you did a lot of peeling back so we can see why they were all drawn to these horses. Was that often like what you were trying to do, was trying to connect those dots between how the horses saved each one?
Yeah, I think that was the goal. Like I really wanted to know like how individually, right, like the impact of horses on their lives. I think we all have this idea of horses, right? We all know that like horses are beautiful and that we like ride them as children at the petting zoo, right? But these animals like are really incredible and special animals, right? Like they have this sort of like redemptive quality to them. Like they have the ability to heal and to sort of make us more compassionate and to soften us up. And the fact that each one of these young men and women, have sort of experienced PTSD like symptoms, and have trauma and pain and have experienced death and violence, and these horses like really have helped them heal through this process, right? And to me, like the ranch, in that context, right, sort of becomes like more than a place full of stables and hay and horses. Like it really becomes a therapy center. And I think for me, like learning more about the impacts of equine therapy was such a big part of this book because, to be honest, like I kind of had no idea, right? Like I didn't think horses could impact people's lives in that way. And I'm hoping this book shows it.
Did you actually do research on that as well to like get a better understanding of equine therapy?
Absolutely. I had to, like I had to, I had to ask people questions. I had to research it. I had to like log in back to my college email to access, those like free academic journals, so, but yeah, I had to. And it really just showed me that like, there's something so healing about the experience of the horses. And like someone like Randy Cook, for example, right? Like it's his goal to be able to replicate this ranch model throughout urban communities in the US, right? And like, that may sound, like this sort of like incredibly great, and like huge, massive undertaking. But I think, what I experienced in a year and a half, I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great model. I think we've tried so many different things, right? But I think we haven't tried horses in the hood, and I think it could work.
I love it. You even gave it a new name of the program, Horses in the Hood. I actually have family members in suburban Maryland who actually have horses. They have like a horse riding group, and like they have a president and everything. It's called the Rough Riders, and they go to like rodeos and stuff. It's like a whole culture, underground culture. Like they have like the jackets and stuff. And every time I come home, like, let's go see the horses. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So for you, like you talked about how the horses saved everybody in this book, all the members of the Compton Cowboys. What about you? Like you have 10 people, not words the unloading, but sharing with you their trauma. In a sense, you're like their therapist too, not just the horses, but you are. What do you do for self-care to unwind and unpack all that you've heard and seen while you're researching your stories?
That's a great question, Angel. I think, for the past 4 or 5 years, like working as a writer and journalist, like I have tended to work on stories, right, where I ask people deeply intimate questions about their lives, right? And, not every story that I work on involves trauma, like I that's not, what I aim to do. I think if you're a person of color in any sort of part of the world, like, unfortunately, your life involves probably, high forms of trauma, and, you are the victim of racism, and especially anti-Black racism. But I think for me, like, this book kind of like forced me to tap into a sort of like emotional source that I had never really tapped into. And, what I was hearing and experiencing was really heavy, right? Like, hearing about Kiara's like sexual assault history, she had never shared that with anybody really, but she shared that with me. Hearing about like the impacts of the death of Keenan's horse as a teenager, Kenneth's alcoholism battles, Anthony's sort of like experience like as an 8-year-old being jumped into a gang. Like, this was really heavy stuff for me. And so what it forced me to do was really sort of like create, ways to really sort of like be good and healthy. And so what that meant was like I had to see a therapist, like I halfway through the book, I started seeing a therapist to really sort of like find healthy ways to make sense of what I was hearing, right? Because when people share these stories with us, right, like the information stays with us, it stays in our bodies and it stays in our spirit. So for me, it's like, how do I find ways to not just get that on paper, but to also process that in a way that allows me to be healthy and happy? And I think like that's part of the quote unquote business, right? That folks don't really talk about, like in journalism school or in the academy. Like, people don't really talk about that aspect, but I think it's a really important thing to be talking about.
And that is very real. Like, I think Steve Padilla posted a quote up. He's like, if the author is not crying or the writer's not crying, neither will the readers. And so like, we feel the pain that our subjects share with us. And like, I think that it's important that we talk about self-care during this time, because I think there was been a culture of just like work, like grind, but to be reflective and see how this stuff impacts us. Like, we're at that moment where we are all like thinking about ourselves, and even therapists have therapists. So why wouldn't we go to someone and talk about and unload and unpack all the things we've heard and seen that like haunts us and stays with us? So tell me a little bit more about the next project.
Right. So I've been working on a podcast with KPCC here in LA. They have this new and really exciting studio called LA Studios, and it's a long form narrative podcast, and it's called California Love. And it's basically, what the show revolves around is this idea that like I've been traveling around the world for a while now, and now I'm back home. And so the whole sort of like premise of the show is me reckoning with the idea of what LA is now, and sort of like the memory of what LA was to me as a child growing up here in the city. And it's a really beautiful show. Like, it's my first time working in sound and audio, and it feels so intimate, and sound is so beautiful. And in terms of like, it's really great because like I'm literally letting people tell their own story, right? In ways where before I was sort of documenting and writing, and now it's like, here's a mic, tell me about your life, right? And to me, like, it's so special and beautiful to be able to do that. But I'm really excited, and like, there's episodes it's all first person, and it's kind of like me reckoning with like the city, with like the memory of the city, experiences in my own life. And it's really personal and intimate. I think people are going to learn a lot about me that I haven't really shared. I think like the titles that we have, right? Like New York Times writer, like author. I think like that only sort of scratches the surface, and I think there's like a lot to my life that a lot of people don't know about that I hope people find interesting.
I'm excited about that. And I follow you on Twitter and on Instagram. And I know there's a big debate about the fireworks that everyone's hearing now. And you're saying like, they've always been here. Is this going to be an episode about the fireworks?
No, it's no, actually, I wish there was an episode about the fireworks, but it's crazy, because I feel like when people complain about the fireworks on social media, like it's just so clear that they're not from LA, or
From
like
here, no.
like, right? So it's like, oh, okay, this person's a transplant. This person, like, obviously, you know, this how they feel. Because to me, like, if you're complaining about the fireworks, you're complaining about people of color, right? Like, because like, so I just don't understand it. You know, and it's also weird because I was one of those kids, right? I was one of those kids who created these like intricate fireworks, who would go buy illegal fireworks and then find ways to like make them louder and more powerful. And, like, I don't know why I did that, but I get it when young Black and brown kids in the hood do that. It's like, I understand. You know, I don't do that anymore, but I get it.
For me, like when I hear people complain about the fireworks, it's either you're a transplant. I'm a transplant, but this is my adoptive home now. Or you don't live in what I call like real LA. But yeah, like I drove in Inglewood and I saw that it was on a corner of like, it was Florence and it wasn't even Inglewood. It was, I think it was Century and La Brea, and they were selling fireworks. And it's like buy one, get one free, TNT. And I was like, this is where all those fireworks are coming from.
Yeah, no, you know, it's even deeper, right? Because a lot of folks actually go to like Tijuana or like Las Vegas to buy these illegal fireworks. Like, it's a whole thing, you know. And
it is. I remember, like, because I'm like a pop culture kind of nerd. I remember, what was his name? Gibson Arena. What's his name? He's a basketball player. Arena Gibson. He like bought a whole bunch of fireworks. They were in the back of his car. Yes. And he had bought them from Mexico. So right. I want to say one last thing. Again, I talked about how Compton has all these images and stereotypes that have been slammed on them. And like this book is kind of rewriting its history and changing the narrative. And I mean, as a reader, as someone who's covered Compton, I appreciate you for that. How have people in the book reacted? How has the city reacted?
I think, you know, I've been getting, fortunately, a lot of different messages from people every single day, right? I've been getting emails and social media messages. I think, you know, for a lot of folks, for a lot of Black and brown people, right? Like, this is a book about Compton, like, not told from the white gaze, right? So I think it's like, finally we have, and I'm not the first, right? Like, I'm not the first to write about Compton or to write about cowboys or Black cowboys. Like, I'm really not the first, but I'm the first to do it through like my perspective. And I think my perspective is one that is deeply rooted in like a strong LA sensibility, right? Like a strong Black and brown LA sensibility. And I think what you said earlier about like, you know, the people who are usually writing about LA or like documenting LA are white guys from like Ohio and like, you know, white folks from like the Midwest. I'm like, I'm not that person. Like, I'm literally like my identity is so woven into the racial fabric of LA. Like, I couldn't be more LA that, you know, like I really am. So I feel like people are like, wow, this is like the LA that I know. This is the Compton that I know. You know, this is the beautiful and complicated Compton that I know. And you know, like, it's my hope that like, it was an honest story. And I feel like folks are gravitated towards it because it is an honest story, and that's all you can ask for.
And it's real. It's just so real. What's the next book?
The next book is a more personal story, actually. You know, the author's note was like, I kind of took it there, you know, like I got really honest about my background. And I think, you know, like a lot of folks will like ask me questions, well, like, hey, like your own story is really interesting, you know, like, would you want to write about it? So I was lucky, like I signed a new book deal before the pandemic with HarperCollins again to write out like a more sort of personal memoir about like my idea of belonging, right? And sort of like the way that I've been navigating that question my whole life, like not just being the son of a Black father, Mexican mother, but also in the work that I've been doing, right? Like, I think at this point in my life, it's pretty clear that like every story that I work on has a strong sort of quality and question about belonging. And, you know, throughout in this book, I'm going to be sort of like interrogating questions about what that means for me personally and my mom and our relationship, and kind of writing about like this idea of homecoming and identity.
Well, we're all looking forward to that. I can't wait. I'm going to take it back to Donna. Donna, thank you so much for having us on as your guest. Like, this was like such a great conversation.
Thank you.
Oh, I could listen to you guys all night. And we've had quite a few questions coming in from our readers. So I'd love to share them. So our first question is from a reader named Melanie, and she'd like to know more about Maisha Akbar, and that's the woman who originally owned the ranch, right? She wants to know, are her children still involved in the riding program today?
Mike's children are, I think, a bit older now, and they aren't involved. A few of them still live on the property, and they sometimes like ride horses, but it's mostly the younger generation. Like it's Randy Hook and it's Carlton and it's the rest of the Cowboys who are like really sort of like making this youth program go right now. And so they aren't really involved, but they're still around sometimes.
Oh, great. And so our next question comes from a reader named Dorothy, and she mentioned that she has read about Black Cowboys recently riding in the streets of Houston, and wonders, and then also obviously had heard about your book, and she wanted to know, are there other Black Cowboy groups? Is this a thing in other cities in America, or just here in Houston?
Absolutely. You know, in writing and researching this book, like I spent time with Black riders in Oakland, in California. I mean, in Los Angeles, of course, and in Houston and Atlanta. And you know, it's a community that also like spreads as far north as Philadelphia and Baltimore, outside of Maryland, as Angel said earlier. And you know, like Black Cowboys, you know, are nothing new. Like Black Cowboys have been around since, you know, the West was founded, like especially following the Civil War. You know, like 1 in 4 of every Cowboys was in fact Black. And I think the fact that Black Cowboys still exist today is not new, and it isn't novel. But I think like a lot of Black Cowboys are really sort of like trying to normalize the sight of Black men and women on horses. And if you ask, you know, most Cowboys, they'll probably tell you that.
It's interesting in the book that Randy Hook, as he took over the program, talked about a new direction of not just keeping the Compton Cowboys to themselves, but connecting with some of the groups around the country. How is that going? Have they been able to connect, or are they still just really kind of struggling to survive here?
No, you know, it's going well. You know, I think like the Compton Cowboys are sort of like existing, you know, in a social media era, right, where it's easier to connect. And I think, you know, when the Compton Cowboys started to become more popular a couple of years ago, they really sort of like started to amass this huge following. And I think, you know, Black men and women who ride horses follow the Cowboys and really connect with them, and it's really great to see.
So our next question comes from a reader named Wendy, and she says, as she's reading the book, there's a movie in her head. She sees this coming to the screen and wants to know, is there in fact a movie in the works?
Yeah, there is a movie in the works. I got really lucky, right? Because like most books that come out, sort of like, you know, they're out for a while and they do really well, and then they sort of get adapted for a television or film. I signed the book deal and the film deal kind of at the same time. I think the New York Times story and how popular that was in 2018, that kind of, you know, built a lot of buzz. So there is a movie. It's being adapted by Searchlight Pictures, and the EP is Prentice Penny, who also does Insecure as well. And I think a script has already been written, and it's looking pretty good. It's looking positive.
Great. And then we also have a question from a reader named Suzanne. And she wonders if your work at all has inspired any of the young Compton Cowboys, the people coming up to want to pursue higher education.
I don't know if my work has inspired them to do that. And to be honest, I think like I'm more inspired by them than I think they are by me. Like we haven't really had that conversation, but I'm here to help in any way. I think like, you know, at the end of the day, like they're all really busy and they're all just trying to survive, and they have families. And they're just trying to do the best they can.
So one of the things we always like to do with our book club is when we started the book club a year ago, we always do our book club in person, and we bring in a bookseller so that we can have the author sign their books. And in the last 2 months, we were able to move our book club to virtual, and we've still been able to partner with a local bookstore. So I wanted to mention that Chevalier's is our bookstore partner for this evening. And they not only have copies of the books on sale, but they have a limited number with signed book plates for this special evening. So those are available, and I know through your publisher, you already arranged to sign them. So thank you very much for doing that for our book club readers. I'd like to invite everyone if you haven't already, to sign up at latimesbookclub.com. latimes.com/book club. That's our book club newsletter, so that you can stay in touch and join us. And then obviously we'll be writing more. We've been writing about the Compton Cowboys there. We'll have a recap and some more information coming up. But I just want to thank you both for what a wonderful conversation. And the time has just gone so quickly. I really could listen to you both. But I just wanted to circle back. Angel, you talked about so many interesting things about your work right now. And I know you've been, we talked a little bit earlier, you talked about you've been, like everyone, covering the coronavirus. You talk a little bit about what kinds of aspects of the current health crisis that you've been writing about and what you're seeing out there in the communities you cover?
So I've actually kind of put a pause on coronavirus because of the uprisings that are happening right now. But when I was writing about coronavirus, which I'll be circling back to because we're surging again and it's still disproportionately impacting Black and Latino people, and just like changing and reshaping how we interact and move around in this world. A couple of stories that I worked on, as I mentioned, it was like the Speakeasy Barbershop. Like hair salons were closed for so long, but like for this kind of cash business, this was like for many people, they were not bringing in any income. They weren't able to apply for like the PPP loans that came with the CARES Act. And so they took creative ways to keep their business open. One woman was moving from Airbnb to Airbnb every weekend doing hair to kind of evade cops. And another guy had rearranged another shop to style hair. But I'm also like talking about those gut-wrenching stories of lost, like because we've lost so many lives. And I've done that as well. And I think as we start to see another wave, or if this is still the same wave from the beginning, I'll be telling the story of like how life have changed, kind of like the ramifications and the fallout from coronavirus. I'll be documenting that probably for the next year or more.
Any final thoughts or any final comments you'd like to share with our book club readers tonight? Any takeaways from you?
Me?
Parting. Oh, I was talking about Angel. I was going to give her her last shot. Any parting comments about the Compton Cowboys, or a favorite part you had that you wanted to share?
Yes, I particularly love there's a section where you talk about armor and how, the Compton Cowboys, like their armors, like the hats and the stirrups and even the Gucci belt, and other people, like that armor might be like a do-rag. And, and for Black people, like our armor is our skin tone and how we move in the world. Like we use it to kind of protect us. And sometimes we don't even use it as a protection, as a guard. This is just who we are. And I think that like that just like really stayed with me, that like sometimes when you meet people, you don't realize you're meeting a version of them because they are wearing their armor. They haven't been able to give it a chance to let that guard down. And so I think that you did a good job of explaining that in the book and really driving that home. I think like during this time where we're facing so much upheaval, that we also be conscious and recognize the armor and the trauma that everyone else is dealing with during these times.
Yeah.
No,
no.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, I was just going to say, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about, after I asked you what my favorite part of the book was, I had many parts that I liked, but I think the thing that sold me on thinking it would be a book I really wanted to share for the book club was the section where we meet Anthony, and his life is so bereft, and he's in prison, and everything is going wrong, and then he starts drawing those horses, and they were his lifeline, and it ended up being the way way he found his way back to the ranch. And for me, I do a lot of work with rescued animals. That was just the healing power of finding something like that, and then how you took him back to the ranch. That was so moving. And I think in each of those human stories, you really just found the humanity and just what was so compelling. So I always like to end our book club. Is there anything we didn't ask you, or anything you'd like to share? You always get the last word as our special guest of the month.
I think that idea of armor was something that I was really sort of thinking about in writing this, right? I think the idea that our skin is armor, right, to me is something that I sort of just heard so many different times in the interviews with these cowboys about like how the skin that we walk around in is so rooted in sort of these like intergenerational practices, right? That at this point, like the hardness that a lot of us develop, is something that we were both born into, but also learned and also had to sort of create in order to survive. And in thinking about armor, like the horses absolutely became a shield and like a sense of armor for the cowboys. And I think, like I said earlier a couple of times, it's both like so beautiful and like genius and creative of us, right? Of our folks, of people in our communities, that we like find ways to survive, that we find ways to adapt, these really sort of trying experiences and circumstances. But it's also tragic, right? That like Black folks have to continue over generations, and decades and centuries to find creative ways to survive. And, like I said, I think for this group of friends, it happens to be horses, but for other Black men and women in other cities across the US, like folks don't have horses. And I think, the fact that these horses save them does make this a story about salvation and about redemption. But like you said, it's also a story about humanity and a story about the ways that we foster community in spite of these challenges and also find joy in spite of these challenges.
Before we wrap up, when does your new podcast series start at KPCC, so we can all make sure to tune in?
It comes out July 9th. The first episode drops July 9th, and after that, it drops every week. So it's coming up pretty soon.
And the name of it again?
It's called California Love.
Great. Well, thank you, Angel, and thank you, Walter, and thank you to all of our readers for joining us. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.